it going, y'all? I'm excited about today. I'm super excited about this. This is going to be a blast. Today we're going to be covering the 14 different noobs. 14 different noobs. Jeez. The 14 different ways I can tell if somebody is a noob at producing and at mixing music. So great to see you guys all here. No, that was not Mario Kart Wii. I believe that was Mario Kart DS. Maybe the 3DS. I think it was the 3DS. Anyway, oh, hang on. We got to turn on the other light here. Got to make it look professional, you know. Hey. Got to make it look professional. Lights are nice. Wires are not. So, I'm excited to have you guys all here. Yeah. We'll check everything for sure. Yeah, I love it. All right, let's go ahead and, I guess without further ado, get right on into this. It's great to see you guys all here. Alex, good to see you here as well. Love to see this. Habibi, Habiby. Is this your 127? Heyo, how you doing? Yeah, love to see it. Cheers from Brazil. Great to see you here as well. I love to see this. All right, so if this is your first time here on a live stream, you know that how I do my live streams is I get on live. This is actually really live, and then I go ahead and share my screen, do all that other fun stuff. But then I do segments where I clip the segments out later for the main videos. So if you guys are like, "Is this really live?" This is really live. I prove it at the beginning, and then I dive into the other stuff. Miles, good to see you here. Hello. All right, so let's go ahead and get on to the old first segment. Your mixes sound like a demo, and I can tell you exactly why. I've done over 600 diagnostic calls with producers just within the last 9 months alone, and the same mistakes show up on almost every single screen share that I get from these producers. These are common bad habits. There's 14 of them today, and the worst part is most of these are the things that YouTube has actually taught you to do. So let's go through all 14 signs that you're mixing like a noob, and I'll show you what to do instead. If this is your first time here, I'm Andrew. I've produced for rock and metal bands all over the world. I've worked with most of the plugin companies you have in your plugin folders like Waves, Slate Digital, Drumforge, JST, STL Tones, and so many more. And I do this all from my small home studio. So let's start with the first mistake that I see constantly. The first mistake is you don't understand the true purpose of the tools you're using. I was recently going through some of my comments on YouTube, and one of my students asked me the same question. They're like, "Hey, I noticed that you used a gate to shorten the kick up a little bit because the kick was bleeding into the next track. So every time the kick would hit, it would bleed into the next signal." And they said, "Why would you use a gate? Why wouldn't you just use a transient shaper?" I got so many questions about this. A transient shaper is better. A transient shaper is better. And everybody kept saying this. Now, here's the thing. A transient shaper and a gate are two separate tools. There's a reason I picked a gate and not a transient shaper. And this is really where the meat and potatoes of this comes from. Because will a transient shaper work? Maybe, maybe not. And that's the big problem with this. So let's go ahead first and dive into what these two tools actually do. So imagine I have a kick drum here that looks like this. And then the next kick drum comes in and is bleeding into that next track a little bit. I want to use a gate to cut this up. Or maybe I could use a transient shaper. Now, here's the difference between a transient shaper and a gate. A gate will take this signal and say it's lasting quite a while. That kick is hitting. So every time this kick is hitting, a gate will say, "You know what? Under this threshold, as soon as it's underneath this threshold, go ahead and cut it off." So then the new signal looks like this. And then it goes into the next one. Cuts it off, and you have a lot of control here. A transient shaper does not do that. This is threshold based. A gate will look at a threshold and say underneath a certain threshold, which would be right here, go ahead and just completely eliminate that. Get it out of there and cut the rest of this nonsense out of here. A transient shaper does not do that. A transient shaper does one thing really well. It shapes the overall transients. It can take this whole signal here and can then sweep it down. So now your kick drum looks like this, maybe more consistently down, but it never cuts it off. It only shapes it down. And so what I like to imagine this as, we have the lightning and we have the thunder. This spike in audio, the transient, is like the lightning. We recently just had this big, massive thunderstorm that happened the other night. And every time the lightning would strike, I'd see the entire outside just get whoosh, lit up. That lightning is your clarity. That clarity from your drums comes from that initial transient, what you can actually hear, that snap. But the thunder happens down here. This is that rumble. This is what you feel in your chest. And so when you're using these tools to shape these kicks, these snares, and everything else, what ends up happening is you're not shaping as much as you thought you could with the transient shaper instead of using a gate instead. So let me show you exactly how this works. So again, now we understand the difference between a transient shaper. A transient shaper doesn't look at the time. It doesn't look at a threshold. It just takes the overall signal and then brings it down, or can bring it up, which is pretty cool as well. That's something that a gate can't do. So a transient shaper does things where it can actually bring things up. But that is two separate tools. And so one of the first things that I notice when somebody is a noob or intermediate at mixing, they're not using the proper tools for the proper job. So just for the sake of argument here, let's go ahead and dive into this. Let's grab the kick here. Let's find where this is sitting at. I will lie down in your grave. So let's go ahead and let's solo this kick. Make sure you're listening on headphones. If you're not listening on headphones, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. But go get some headphones so we can hear. There's a lot of rumbling going on in the low end. So if I go ahead and I grab a gate, go ahead and grab the dynamic section here. I'll grab a gate, and then let's just tighten up this kick. So tightening that up quite a bit. I'm going to bring the release down as well. With it off. On. Off. So it's grabbing that and it's tightening that up. Now, if I go ahead and turn this off, so that's a lot tighter. It's not having a bunch of low end that's rumbling on. But what if I decided to use a transient shaper instead? So if I go ahead and I grab, kilohertz transient shaper, it's going to take the overall signal and bring the sustain down. And that's the problem. I don't want that sustain to go down. I want that sustain to go up, but I want it to cut at a specific time. So with the transient shaper, and then with the gate. Transient shaper, and the gate. You can hear there's more low end when I'm using the gate instead of the transient shaper because it's actually cutting off that signal, and that's not what I want. The gate keeps that full thunder and then ends it, and the shaper actually thins the thunder of that kick drum out. And so it's subtle, it's little things, but this is the kind of stuff that takes a beginner or an intermediate all the way to a pro level because you understand the two separate types of tools and when they're both useful. I'm not saying you can't use a transient shaper for this job, but you need to understand what it's doing. It just shapes that ending of that kick drum. It doesn't actually give you more control over that overall. I have so much more control here. I could have the release up a little bit. I have it at 60 milliseconds. Over here, I've had this one over here set to 160 milliseconds. I can bring the range down. So I could say, you know what? After it goes below the threshold, instead of turning it down by 100 dB, go ahead and turn it down by 50 dB instead. You have way more control over a gate instead of a transient shaper. A transient shaper is just going to shape the overall signal and it fades it out. The gate will give you way more control. Now, a little pro tip on this one. If you want to go a little bit farther with this, if you just want to gate the low end of the kick out, you can. So I'll grab multipass. I'll go ahead and I'll select this from around maybe 100 hertz. I'll go ahead and I'll grab a gate. And then I can say, hey, underneath that low end is rumbling too much. I want the sustain on the rest of the kick drum to continue on out, but behind it, under that 100 hertz, I want that to gate pretty quickly. So I'm getting that sustain from that kick drum. It's standing out a little bit more, but I'm not getting that nasty low end that's continuing to drag on through. So there's lots of different options that we have, but you need to understand the difference between a gate and a transient shaper. They are two separate tools. And just because they're two separate tools doesn't mean you can't use it for the same job all the time, but they are two separate tools. There's a reason why a transient shaper is not called a gate and why a gate is not called a transient shaper. These are two separate tools. So the first mistake I see all the time is producers are grabbing the wrong tools for the right job. They've identified what the right job is, but they've grabbed the wrong tool to make up for that. And it just becomes an absolute mess, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful. So we need to understand what the tools actually do, why and when to use them. That's the main goal. That is the main goal. So that's the big noob mistake number one that I see. I like to think of it like this. The gate keeps the full thunder in and then ends it. And the shaper thins that thunder out from that kick drum. And so you choose wisely. Which one are you trying to do? The next mistake that I see all the time is in the same vein, is not understanding truly what the actual signal does. If you are an audio engineer, you're a mixing engineer, you need to understand one thing in particular. You need to understand this, the actual waveform. If you don't understand what the waveform does and why it exists, you're going to start using the wrong tools for the job. One of the questions I recently got from one of my students, he said, instead of using a clipper, why doesn't he use a bit crusher instead? Because he was trying to round the transients off on some of his drums. And so when he took a look at this, he's like, well, I want to bring this down. So to square it off, what I'll use is a bit crusher instead. And this is not the ideal situation for here. What you want to use is you want to use a clipper to actually control that. And here's why. Think of bit crushing as photo resolution. So it's crushing everything. It creates these little steps. We can actually see the steps, even though this is super high quality. The more we zoom in, the more we can actually see the actual steps. This is a little snippet of audio and a snippet of audio and a snippet of audio. And depending on what resolution you're recording in, just like when you are recording with a camera, is it 720p? Is it 1080p? Is it 4K? It's the same thing here in audio. But in order to trick your eyes, you don't really need a whole lot. But in order to trick your ears, you need a lot. So you need 44,100 samples per second in order to truly trick your ears. And so it's a little sample, it's a little sample, it's a little sample of audio, and they all get pushed together to create excuse me, your sample rate. It's just like frame rate. If you've played video games, you know that 60 FPS feels nice and smooth. 30 FPS can still feel somewhat smooth, but not nearly as much. And then lower than 30 FPS, 20 FPS, things start just getting pretty rough. It's the same thing here. And so there's different tools that we have to be able to control this. But let me show you what it actually looks like when we actually bring in drums. And we either crush them, bit crush them, or we actually add a clipper. So let me just go ahead and find a drum loop on Splice. That one will work. Let's go ahead and drag this one in. So first, let's go ahead and let's add some clipping. And then while we're at it, let's go ahead and we will just render this section out. So I'm going to go ahead in here and I'm going to bounce to a new section. And we're going to label this clipped. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the exact same thing, but with bit crushing. So we'll turn off the clipper. We'll go ahead and we'll add the bit crusher. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do the exact same thing. We will bounce this one to a new track. And we'll call this Bit Crushed. If we actually look at the waveforms here, you'll notice that they're a lot different overall. And so let's go ahead, we'll bring the overall volume of the stuff that we have down. But if you take a look at the Bit Crushed one, you're starting to see a lot of inconsistencies here, right? It's asynchronous. Like there's some of the stuff that goes down below, there's some of the stuff that comes up and above. But if we look at the original, it's nice and clean. And if we look at the clipped, it's also nice and clean. But bit crushing is creating these squares of waveforms where sometimes it's down, sometimes it's up. And it's creating these steps that are just not natural. So is it squaring off the waveform? Kind of, but it's doing a lot more of an aggressive job with it, and it's sounding way worse. Versus the clipped version. So again, up against the original, you can see that it's actually squared out some of the waveforms. There's that peak. The clipping is actually squared off those waveforms. There's those peaks, and it's actually brought it down, but it's kept the clarity pretty much the same. It does change a little bit, and it does add some slight harmonics, but it keeps it pretty much the same for the most part. Listen to the difference between the two as I cycle between the original and the clipped. You can hear a little bit of distortion that's going on because that's what clipping does. Clipping is adding a type of distortion to things. So you can hear the slight difference, but it's actually pretty impressive. And then the bit crushed version just starts to sound a lot worse. And a little bit of bit crushing can make things sound pretty bad. If this is the sound you're going for, by all means, if you're going for that bit crush sound, then fine, that's awesome, and that's really cool. But you need to know what the tools do and when to actually use these tools. You need to understand that you are recording in actual wave files. These come up and they come down. This is what's called zero crossing. This line here is zero crossing. So anything below is negative, anything above is positive. Imagine it like this. The speaker has to reverberate, it has to shake back and forth, right? If you look at your speaker and you use the slow motion on your camera, it goes back and forth, right? Positive will come out to you, negative will come in, depending on how you have this polarity set up. If you flip the polarities, it's the same thing, but that speaker has to shake back and forth like this in order to actually create that signal and that sound. It is moving air, wiggling air to recreate that signal to you. When you understand what the waveform's actually doing, you start to understand the job of the tools you have a little bit more. And you can see that it is bit crushing is creating these not even kind of signals where this is going up and down and up and down. This one is going down and then it's going up and then it's going down again. And it's staying below zero crossings, it's going above zero crossings, and it starts to sound really, really bad. The more that we can come across this zero crossings, the more often, the better off we're going to be. And the better off if we have less steps involved here, the better off we're going to be. That's essentially the fidelity of the recording that you have. The most standard for recording in professional music studios is 24-bit, 48 kilohertz. That's the standard across the board. You can also use 44.1 if you want to, or 48 kilohertz, but most of the time people are recording in 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, and sometimes 32-bit float if you want to avoid any sort of clipping if your interface can actually handle it. But 24-bit, 48, or 24-bit, 44.1 is the main goal. And so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to these things. We understand what these tools are doing, so we understand when we should actually use these specific tools. Mistake number 3 is treating saturation like it just does one thing. My mentor said this years ago, and I absolutely loved it. He said, it is not a layer on top. Saturation does not add this extra layer on top. It's literally rewriting the signal. Imagine adding a spice that actually changes the dish. You're adding garlic, or you're adding a specific spice that changes the entire dish. It is not that little garnish that you put on top to make it sound a little bit better or make it taste a little bit better. It's actually a spice that completely changes the dish. How you season chicken will completely change whether you're making chicken masala or you're making chicken parm or whatever you're making. That spice can change absolutely everything. Saturation does some interesting things overall that I think is fun, and I created one of these tools to understand what saturation actually does. So as we start to bring up the signal, you'll start to notice, we bring up the drive, you'll start to notice a few things. Not only is it compressing the signal, right? This is drums before. This is what drums look like after. It's starting to compress the signal. It's also adding harmonics down here. So it continues to add more harmonics. If we bring up the character, it can even make that asynchronous kind of, I'm missing the word. It's not asynchronous, but you get the point, where it's not equal on top as it is on the bottom. So as you bring up the character, also known as bias sometimes as well, it creates these really interesting characters to the overall sound that you have, which can add in different harmonics when you bring up that character. Really interesting stuff. And then if we bring up the drive and we bring down the output, you can actually see that it's compressed the signal. It's clipped the signal. It's rounded out the transients a little bit. It's doing multiple things. It's adding harmonics. It's compressing the signal. It's clipping the top end. It's rounding out those transients. It's doing a lot of things. Saturation is not a one-trick pony like compression is. It's not a one-trick pony like EQ is. Saturation is doing multiple things. It is rewriting the entire signal that you run into saturation, which, by the way, if you like this tool, I have a couple tools on saturation and compression to truly understand how these work. They're interactive. You can play around with them. You can have some fun with them. Links to that are down in the description below. Lots of really good stuff here, but that's what it does. Again, you can see as I start to bring up the drive, it's starting to overall change that signal. It's rewriting the signal in multiple different ways, adding more harmonics, compressing it, rounding out the transients. It's doing a lot. Asymmetrical. Thank you. Thank you, BY3176. Asymmetrical. When you bring up the character, it changes the asymmetry of the overall signal. So it's making it asymmetrical. So it's not completely congruent with everything. It's really cool. It's really cool. And sometimes the character knob is called bias in some of your saturation tools and plugins. Not every single saturation plugin has a character or a bias knob, but if it does, it's worth trying to see if you like it or not. But again, the more you bring up the character, the more essentially kind of bit crush sound you're going to get out of it. It's not bit crushing, but it's kind of similar in a way. It's very interesting. Saturation does a lot of really interesting things. And so because of that, once we understand what these tools are doing, we then can say, hey, wait a minute. Well, when I was bringing up the saturation on that tool, I noticed that it was also compressing the drums. So if we select drums here and we go ahead and bring this up a bit, when I bring the drive up, it's compressing these drums. It's rounding out the transients. So if it's doing multiple things, do I need to add compression to my drums? Do I need to add clipping to my drums? And that's the perfect question to ask. Once you understand what these tools do, you can start asking very intelligent questions like this. So for my drums here, we can go ahead and I've added some saturation and some clipping to this overall. I've even added a little bit of compression as well. So I'm using all three tools, but you'll notice the big change in the tools here is really with the saturation and the clipper. So let's go ahead, listen to these drums by themselves. I'll bring in the saturation here, and then I'll bring in the clipper right afterwards. And you notice that saturation does the majority of the work here. It's doing a lot of work. Saturation is not a one-trick pony. It is not this layer on top, as my mentor said. It is rewriting the signal on the way through. It is a spice that will change the dish completely. It is not a garnish that you add on top. It's not that little green leaf that you add to your pasta dish. It is completely changing the signal. Think of saturation as spices and not as that garnish on top. And when you start to understand that saturation does multiple things, you then have the skills to understand that maybe saturation would be a better fit, a better job for this tool specifically. I do this on guitars all the time. On my guitars, I'm not a big fan of adding compression to my guitars. They're already pretty compressed by default. When you run stuff through saturation, like I showed earlier, it compresses things naturally. If we come up in here into my saturation tool, if I go here and select guitar, you'll see that as I bring up the drive, which is exactly what your amp is doing, by the way, you are driving that amp, you're adding that compression to that amp. It's not compression per se. It is adding saturation, that distortion, and that naturally compresses the overall signal here. So once you understand that, it's like, well, wait a minute. If I have high gain guitars, then they're already somewhat compressed by default. So do I really need to add compression? And then again, that is a great question to ask. And so for me, I personally am not a massive fan of adding compression. I'll add saturation instead. So let me go ahead. I have a little bit of limiting. I'll go ahead and turn that off. And let's listen to what these guitars sound like with and without saturation. Now, again, this is tube saturation. It's a little bit more subtle, so make sure you're listening on headphones so you can truly understand the difference between this being on and off. But I want you guys to go ahead and listen to the low mids of these guitars as I turn this on and off. It's bringing up some of the low mids. It's bringing up some of that mid-range bite to it as well and getting it to stand out in the mix even more. Because saturation is not just adding one thing. It's also adding some extra harmonics. It's adding spice to this dish. It's adding some grit to these guitars that I didn't have before and can really make it stand out in the mix. That just a little bit of saturation can go a long ways. Be careful with saturation. Don't overdo it. That's another thing I see all the time. Don't overdo it. But what I like to do is I will go ahead and I'll dial in that saturation until it becomes extremely obvious, and then I'll dial it back until it cleans up a little bit. And that's usually a pretty good sweet spot for guitars, for drums, really anything else. We want to add some seasoning to that. And that's essentially what saturation is doing. It's doing multiple things at once. And once we understand what all the tools do, it makes it way easier for us to understand how to use these tools. Makes those guitars stand out in the mix even more. Saturation is a very powerful tool, and it's not just doing one thing. It's doing lots of different things. Real quick, I want to let you guys know that I have a 3-day vocal session coming up, literally starting today. I am working with one of the best vocalists I have ever worked with, ever. They're coming to this studio, and I'm inviting you to come along as well. Over the course of 3 days, we are going to be recording, figuring out exactly how to get a great professional sounding recording, how to get really good takes, understanding what is a good take versus a bad take, how to comp vocals. We're going to be editing, and we're going to be mixing over the course of 3 days. You get lifetime access to all the recordings. This is pretty much a one-shot deal. I don't know if we'll ever be able to do this again. Links to that will be down in the description below. So if you can't attend live, you can still join. You can still get access to all of the recordings. You get lifetime access to the recordings. And they will all be down in the description below. Go down, click on the 3-day vocal challenge, and you can join there. It is one of the best things I think I've done in a very long time. I've never had another artist come into the studio and allow me to do stuff with them. And this artist has been amazing to work with. And I think that you guys are going to get a lot of value out of this. Whether you can attend live or you can't, still join, because inside of the community, you're going to be getting lifetime access to all of the recordings. At the end, I will give you access to all of the recordings that you can download for life, you can use for life. You guys are really, really going to enjoy that. If you struggle with vocals, if you want your vocals to sound super professional, this is for you. If it's past the time and you're watching this into the future, you can then click the other link that's right above it on working with me directly. If you want me to help you with your music, dive into your sessions together, links to that are down there as well. The next noob mistake that I see all the time is you try to fix everything in your mix. Just a couple days ago, I was mixing live for this band. I was actually in the band, and as I'm sitting there with the mixing engineer, he's back there, we're dialing some stuff in, the snare ring was really bad. Every time the snare ring would hit, it would just boom, boom, and keep going. Now, the proper solution for this is not necessarily what people would think. There is a 200 hertz boost, so that snare just kept ringing and ringing and ringing right around 200 hertz. So what a lot of people would do is they would say, okay, well, we just need to grab an EQ. We need to turn that 200 hertz down so we can kind of control some of that ring. Now, some other people who know these tools a little bit better might say, hey, let's use a multi-band gate, and let's go ahead and gate that 200 hertz and tighten that up even more. I didn't do any of that. And as I'm working with this guy next to me, he was suggesting some of this stuff. He's like, let's go ahead and grab an EQ. Let's throw on a plugin and see if we can get this fixed. And I didn't do any of that. The proper solution was to retune the drums. so that way that 200 hertz wasn't ringing too much. Because here's the thing with 200 hertz, that adds a bunch of beef and fatness to these snares. If I go ahead and solo the drums here, and then I'll go ahead and I'll grab an EQ on the snare. That 200 hertz is bringing that snare volume up. It's actually really nice and it sounds good. And so we didn't want to cut that. If we cut that, it sounds fake and it sounds artificial. Let's just solo this snare specifically and I'll show you exactly why. So if we took 200 hertz and we cut it with an EQ, we're completely losing that beef of that snare. So we could use a multi-band gate if we wanted to try to control that as well, but even then, it's still cutting that beef of that snare. So we were kind of at a conundrum. This is the thing that most people miss. They think that they can just fix things in the mix later on, and that's just not the case. So what I did was I pulled out my phone and I called the drummer. He's still on stage. And I call him and I said, hey, pull out your wallet. So I had him pull out his wallet. He took his wallet. We did not have time to retune the drums. We had 10 minutes before we went live. So I said, we don't have time to retune the drums. Take your wallet, set it on the snare. He set it on the snare and it changed everything to the point that everyone around me, as I'm sitting on this console, we're mixing this live. As soon as he put that on the snare and he started hitting it, everyone was like, oh, there it is. It fixed everything for us. And so what intermediate mixing engineers and beginner mixing engineers will do all the time is they will start to try to see if they can fix things in the mix when it's not actually a mixing issue. It's your sound. It's the source. Everyone says you got to get it right at the source, get it right at the source, get it right at the source. And I understand the sentiment behind that, but they don't tell you what getting it right at the source actually means. How do you know if the snare sounds better or sounds worse when you tuned it differently? This is where spending some time, getting some skill, see if you can download the stems. For every single one of my students that I work with, they get access to tons of different sessions that they can download and see exactly what I did. They can turn the plugins off. They can look inside of that stuff. They can download the stems from those sessions. They can drag in any DAW at all. And these things are such eye-openers for my students because they can literally see what I've done in real time and they can play around with that stuff as well. They can say, I love the way your drums sound. How do I get to sound that way? And they realize the samples that I chose. They understand the reason why I picked this one drum set over another drum set, why I chose this snare over another one. If you are working with MIDI, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to the different snares you have access to. Like in Modern or Massive 2, you have access to a whole bunch of different kinds of snares. This drum library here, I had two different snares. I have this one, and I have this one. And in my opinion, this one here, this higher tune snare, I didn't like as much. I liked this one more. And so because of that, I used that snare, not this one. I was looking for a more fat sounding snare. It's not that this one sounds bad, it's just not what I was going for in the song itself. And so I chose a different snare. I didn't try to fix this other snare in the mix. I just chose one that worked better for this mix, and it completely changed everything. So whether you're doing this live, you're doing this in the studio, you're using MIDI drums, it doesn't matter, it remains the same. If you try to fix everything in the mix, you're just going to create more problems. Cutting that 200 hertz eliminated the beef out of that snare, and that was a really bad decision, and we could not make that decision. Trying to add multi-band gate might have solved it a little bit more, but would not have solved it in the way that retuning the snare or just throwing a freaking wallet on the snare did. The moment he put that wallet on the snare, everyone's eyes lit up and they're like, that's the sound we're going for. It completely changed everything. It was 10 minutes before we went live. Super stressful. I love mixing live though when I do. I prefer to stay in the studio, but mixing live is also a lot of fun. So try to stop fixing everything in the mix and see if you can go back a little bit further. If you notice that there's an issue with your snare, if you notice there's an issue with your drums, if you notice there's an issue with your guitars, try changing the guitar tone. Try changing how you play. Try those things first. Once you identify the issue, then see what you can do before the mixing process to make it sound even better. One of the most common questions I get all the time is people will be downloading these stems from really popular bands like from Nail the Mix and everything else. And they're like, man, as soon as I drag it into my DAW, it sounds great. And then I try to mix my own music and it doesn't sound this good. What's going on? That's because your skills in mixing are probably pretty decent. your skills in mixing got this really good sounding recording to that next level. But then when you're trying to take your recordings to the next level, things fall flat. And you need to understand why. Why did those things fall flat? It happened probably before the mix. So number 4, stop trying to fix everything in the mix. That is one of the biggest ways I know that I am working with a new mixing engineer or producer, because they're trying to fix everything in the mix when it's not a mixing issue at all. Sometimes it's actually just before that. The next thing is assuming that a mix knob is the same thing as creating a bus. That's not the case. So for example, if we wanted to add vocals or reverb to our vocals here. So let's just go ahead and turn off the reverb that I already have on these vocals.
I would lie down in your grave if that meant.
What a lot of people will do is they'll go ahead and they'll say, you know what? I want to go ahead and I want to add a reverb to these vocals, and they'll just throw this right on the vocals themselves. And then they'll use the mix knob as their bus. Now this can work, but it's not completely the same. It's not, and I don't really like using a mix knob, specifically for reverbs and delays, if I can avoid it. And here's why. So we can go ahead and we can dive this in.
Down in your grave if that meant I could take your pain away on your behalf. I'd split in half.
And that's not bad. It's okay. But there's that next level to this that can really take this even farther. And here is how I like to think of it. Imagine this. When you are creating a bus, you are essentially doing one thing. You take the signal, so let's say Vox here, and that signal gets split. So you go in here, and that signal gets split from here, over, and here, over, right? So inside of the plugin, let's say you did this with your reverb plugin. You go ahead, you add your plugin, which is your box. Actually, let's go ahead and make this box way bigger so I can actually show you what's going on. The signal comes in, it splits the signal, it goes into the reverb, and then it comes back out and goes out. This is all inside of this main plugin. The problem with using a mix knob is our control ends there. A mix knob does not allow you to control the rest of the stuff that's going on. Now, the proper way to do this is to have the signal come in, it goes out, and then you send another split to a reverb plugin, and then it goes back out to the main out. And that's the way to do it, because then we can add other stuff in front or behind the reverb. For example, what I'm going to show you right now. So let's go ahead and just remove this room reverb that I have here on the actual vocals. And then let's go ahead and create a send. So I've created the send. I'm going to send it over here. And just for the sake of argument here, I'm going to use the exact same reverb that I used before. So we'll use our room reverb, but this time our mix knob is going to be 100% wet. And then I have my own reverb slider that I can move here.
Down in your grave if that meant I could take your pain.
Now this is where things get really cool. I can tune this reverb, I can saturate this reverb, I can use just about anything I want here. I could automate this fader up and down. Yes, you could automate the mix knob, but it's not the exact same thing. So if I go ahead, I'll add a compressor, and then I'll sidechain this compressor to those main vocals. And then, with the vocals in, every time the vocals come in, it's turning that reverb down.
Down in your grave if that meant I could take your pain away on your behalf. I'd split in half to make.
So every time the vocal stops, that reverb comes back in. It creates a nice lush sounding reverb without eating into the mix of the vocals. So just for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and let's go back and add that same reverb back in that we had before. Bring in that room reverb. And then as I start to bring this up, the mix knob, we'll just bring the mix knob up to try to balance it in a very similar space.
Down in your grave if that meant.
Now with the bus.
Down in your grave if that meant.
Way cleaner. Turn the bus off. Let's turn the plugin on with the mix knob.
Down in your grave if that meant I could take your pain away on your behalf. I'd split in half to make you whole again. I would lie down in your grave if that meant.
Notice how those vocals are just standing out in the mix a lot more because we actually split the signal. We could do so many other cool things with this. One of my favorite things to do with vocal reverbs is to add some saturation to these. So maybe I'll add a little bit of distortion or saturation to this after the reverb.
I could take your pain away on your behalf. I split in half.
Brings it up in the mix a lot more, saturates it. You can even put it behind the reverb if you feel like it's adding a little bit too much grit.
Lie down in your grave if that meant I could take your pain away.
Makes it stand out in the mix even more. We could EQ this reverb. We could do so many things with this reverb because we have the control, because we've added it here on this bus. And that's something that you just don't get with a mix knob. So essentially, a mix knob is creating a bus inside of the plugin, but you completely lose control of it when you don't put it on its own individual bus over here. So stop using mix knobs, especially in your reverbs and delays, and start creating their own buses so that way they can all live together in harmony. And it just makes everything so much better. The next new mistake that I see all the time is you don't know the difference between the two types of buses. Again, I'm going to use the water analogy here for this. So one of the biggest new mistakes that I see all the time is people don't understand the two different types of buses. There's two separate types that you need to be aware of. And once you understand the two separate types, you then can have so much more control than you normally would. So I like to imagine it like water. Let's just say your vocal is here, your Vox is here, and let's just say it's a water pipe that comes out here and goes all the way to your output. So we'll say out for here. Your vocal's coming in, it's going through, and it's going to the output. Now, what if we wanted to have multiple vocals? So we'll say Vox here, and it's going out, and it's going back to the out again here. Or we wanted a third vocal that's here. The first type of buses is one of the most common that people use, where they're like, you know what, I'm going to take all of these vocals, and then I'm just going to go ahead, and instead of doing this, I'm just going to take all of my vocals, so we'll do V1, V2, V3. They're going to all get sent to the same bus, and they're going to go here, and then this is going to be the one that gets sent out. So we can add plugins directly to all of the vocals at once. That is the first type of buses. The second type of buses is where, let's say you have this vocal here, but you want to split out a separate signal to then go to the output. So you have your main vocal, then you have your separate, what's called a send. So you have grouped buses where you take multiple vocals and put them all in one bus, or multiple drums, put them all in one bus, or you have sends where you split the signal out and create a separate one. It's still buses, but it's two different types of buses. And the reason why is because sometimes you want to process all of the vocals together or all of the drums together. I like taking all of my drums and compressing all of my drums together. Sometimes I want to take my vocals and I want to put them on a separate send and add maybe saturation to this separate send. So I still have my clean vocal, but I have a separate saturated send vocal. Or maybe I'm adding reverb. So I'll go ahead and add reverb to this. And then I can create saturation, reverb, whatever else I want on a separate send and blend that in. For example, parallel compression with drums is creating a separate send. Compressing all of the drums together is where that creates a grouped bus. There's two different types of buses, and you need to know how to create each in any DAW. The first type is where you take all of these tracks, you can right-click, you can pack them to a folder and add a bus for selected channels. Most DAWs allow you to do that by right-clicking. The second is by going inside of the actual mixer itself, and then you create what's called a separate send. You're using buses in both cases, but how the bus is being used is completely different. So you need to understand the two different types of buses and when that matters. And I like to use the water pipe analogy because sometimes you want to put a valve on all of the water. Sometimes you want to split the water out and have it go to a bathroom, and so you can put a valve on that there. So that way your kitchen still has water, but you can shut your bathroom off by itself. Same thing. It's water pipes and valves, but how it's set up is completely different. And that is one of the biggest mistakes I see all the time, where people don't understand the two separate types of buses. The next is thinking that you can gain match your EQ moves. One of my students boosted the lows and the highs of his guitars, and then he decided to go ahead and turn everything else down to make up for that because, well, obviously the signal's going to be louder. But what happened was he completely lost his guitar bite. So let's go ahead and recreate this here, and then I'll show you why this is just horrible advice. And this is the next thing. I see it on YouTube all the time. Gain match your plugins. I will die on this hill. I do not believe that you need to gain match your plugins all the time. And this is why. If we go ahead and we solo these guitars here, and then I go ahead and I add in an EQ for these guitars, and I decide that I want to boost the low end a little bit. So let's go ahead and create a low shelf here and boost the low end, and let's go ahead and boost the high end. I'm not saying that I would do this, I'm just using this as an example. But if we go ahead and we boost the low end with a low shelf and we boost the highs, well, let's just say we've turned this up by 4 dB and we've turned the low end up by 4 dB as well. So the signal of the guitars is going to go up. So what a lot of people do is they say, well, I turned this up by 4 dB, so now I need to turn this down by 4 dB. Because I boosted the lows, I boosted the highs, so now I need to go ahead and I need to gain match that. I boosted these up by 4, now I need to bring them down. And again, that's still not even accurate because 4 dB on the low end plus 4 dB on the high end is not a 4 dB cut. And it's also not 8. 4 plus 4 does equal 8, but not in the context of signal. That collection of signal doesn't necessarily mean that it's bringing it up by 8 dB. But let's just say for the sake of argument, people are going to bring it here down by 4 because that's what I see that commonly happens. Well, now what's happened is I just completely lost my guitar bite. And that's because what you've done is you've taken the low end, you've brought up the low end, you've taken the high end, you brought up the high end, and then what you did is you just brought everything back down. It would have been better for you to just create a mid-range cut if that's what you were going to do, because that's essentially what you've created. If you take all of these and bring them down, you've just created a low-end cut, and that's all you've done. Gain matching your EQ moves is a horrible idea because you can't gain match your EQ moves. Like I said before, even 4 dB here and 4 dB here. So you're thinking, okay, Andrew, well, what if I go ahead and meet myself in the middle with 2? Like I already explained, 4 in the low end plus 4 in the high end does not equal 8 dB of total volume, but you get the point. So let's just go ahead and split the difference at 2. You're still changing the overall shape of this. When you are making EQ moves, one of the worst things you could do is try to decide if that EQ move was a good thing or not by bringing the overall volume down, because you're changing the shape of the EQ. You are adjusting volume. EQ at its core is just volume control on specific frequencies. And so what we did was when we eliminated this EQ, all of a sudden his bite in his guitars went back. So he wanted some more low end, he wanted a little more high end. And notice how the mid-range is the thing that's changing here. And we're not even touching the mid-range, but we are, because we boosted the lows, we boosted the highs, and now we're bringing the overall gain down, which means that we changed the mid-range. We changed the relationship each of the frequencies have with one another. That's the goal of EQ, by the way, is to change the relationship that you have with the frequencies. And so when you start to bring the gain down or try to auto-gain, some of these plugins have an auto-gain feature here, trying to make up for that, it just doesn't work, and I will die on this hill. When you change the relationship of the frequencies, you're going to change the relationship that it has with the overall volume. If you have to bring the overall volume down because you realize that you brought up too much, or maybe you took out too much and you have to bring it back up, then that's fine. But it is not a, does this EQ make sense? Should I turn this on and off, bypass it, level matched to see if it makes it sound any better? That is not the goal of these gain knobs here at the end. The goal of these gain knobs is to not decide whether that EQ move was a good move or not. It is to bring up the gain that you cut or take down the gain that you brought up, but not to decide whether it was a good EQ move or not. And that is the biggest thing. I see this all the time, and it absolutely frustrates me. Same thing with compression. You're changing the overall relationship between the high end and the low end. So when you compress the highs and you bring everything back up, you're like, well, it sounds louder. It's like, well, duh, it sounds louder because we've changed the relationship between the high-level signals and the low-level signals. We've compressed them, and so it's going to have more perceived loudness, even if the loudness down here is still staying at around -0, peaking, right? That completely changes the relationship. That perceived volume is what's being changed. And so we have to be very careful with us constantly gain matching our plugins to make sure that things work all the time. I'm not saying you shouldn't gain match your plugins to make decisions. I'm saying you should. I'm just saying that you need to understand what that gain match actually does to your guitars. And you saw and heard right here that it completely changed the relationship that we had here with those guitars. Number 8 is mixing louder and calling it better. Every time something is louder, it just sounds better. ties right into that EQ thing that we were just talking about. Just because it's louder doesn't mean that it's better. In fact, I would argue that sometimes louder isn't always better to begin with. We want to be very careful with how we're doing this. We want to pay attention to this stuff. Louder feels like it's better because of one thing. It's called the Fletcher-Munson curve. And that Fletcher-Munson curve is this curve here. Now, again, it's not completely accurate. They're using a fawn. It's just a fawn way, pun intended, of trying to objectively measure something that's super subjective. But the curve and the concept of the curve remains the same. When we bring things up in volume, we get an artificial low-end enhancement and some of the mid-range as well. And so we think that because there's a low-end boost and there's a bit of a mid-range boost, that it sounds better. But if your mix can't handle it to still sound good at lower volumes, then you haven't got to a good mix yet. So when you are comparing your mixes to a reference mix, for example, you want to make sure that you're level comparing. You have your mix at the same level that your reference mix is at. This is where gain matching actually matters here. You want to make sure that they're equal, so that way you're not hearing an artificial low-end boost in the master on the Spotify version that you have. It makes a big difference. So when you are mixing, stop mixing loud so often and start bringing it down in the mix. There's an app that I have on my phone that reads the dB meters, and sometimes I just like to shoot for mixing right around 70 dB, 60 dB. I'll test things at 80 dB down to 50, 60 dB. Sometimes I'll test things even louder. I want to test my mix at different volume levels because everyone's going to listen at different volume levels, and it needs to hold up no matter what volume it's going through. So when you are testing your mixes, test your mixes against a reference mix, but at the same volume. So you can understand, do I need more low end or not? Because if I just turn my track up overall, and I'll do this here, as I turn my listen bus up and down, notice that the low end starts to get more enhanced as I bring the overall volume up here on this listen bus. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to do this in an easier way with a gain plugin, just right here at the end. Again, I'm doing nothing but turning up and down the volume here. It doesn't even sound fair because when I bring the volume down, the low end disappears. It feels like the low end dips in volume even more than the rest of the track. And so sometimes when you're like, I need more low end in my track because I'm listening to this other song on Spotify, it's like, well, maybe that song on Spotify is just over the volume that yours is at across the board. So that's why it's very important to make sure that we're not just mixing loud all the time and calling it good and calling it better. The next mistake that I see, mistake number 9, is high passing everything automatically. This is one of those rules that I see all the time where everyone goes ahead and they just decide to high pass everything. On these electric guitars here, I am not high passing these electric guitars at all. In fact, I'm creating a low end shelf and I'm dipping it. I've said this multiple times before, but we treat sometimes EQ like an on and off switch. This is too dark, right? And maybe say this is too bright. Well, we need to start treating EQ like a dimmer switch. Bringing the lights down a little bit is better than having too much light or not enough light. We want to adjust these things accordingly. And this is one of the biggest mistakes I see where people are just creating a low cut and they're like, you know what? There's some rumble below 100 hertz on these guitars. They don't need to be there. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to cut that out there. It's like, are you sure it doesn't need to be there? Are you sure? Sometimes it doesn't need to be there, depending on the mix that you're doing, but sometimes it does. I've been mixing a lot of thal recently, and I've noticed that there's a lot of low end in thal guitars. Like so much low end in thal guitars. And so because of that, I just can't create a low cut at 100 hertz and just call it good. Maybe if I was making punk rock, I could, but not all the time. So you need to understand the genre that you're in and start treating EQ like a dimmer switch. I can bring down the lows, but I don't need to cut it entirely all the time. This is one of those rules versus a decision that you need to understand. Rules are things that people are like, I always cut everything below 100 hertz except for the kick and bass. So that way they can stay down there in the low end. And I used to do this for a long time, and I'd always wonder why my mixes lacked that energy in the low end. It's because there was just not a whole lot of energy in the low end. The bass and the kick should be the thing that's driving the low end, but my guitars, it's okay if there's a little overlap down there. It sounds good, and so I want to go ahead and I want to leave it. You always want to make sure that you're following decisions, your decisions, not necessarily rules that you see on YouTube all the time. I'm not saying in this video that you should cut at 100 hertz all the time. I'm also not saying in this video that you should not cut at 100 hertz all the time. What I'm saying in this video is you should try both and make a decision. This is the type of advice that you just never see on YouTube. It's just not there. And I have a lot of beliefs. Sometimes I think it's because some of these people just don't really do this all the time. They haven't made a whole lot of songs, and so they're called pretengineers, where they're pretending they're an engineer, but they really haven't made a whole lot of music. They really haven't actually done this for years. And sometimes they're just trying to create a title and a thumbnail that's so clickbaity that they can just get you in. And I understand the concept of trying to make a video that gets people to watch, but you can't give people bad advice because of that. And this video, I'm telling you, try cutting, but also try just lowering the overall volume of everything with a low shelf instead of cutting. Test it and make a decision, not following a rule blindly just because you can. Quick reminder, the 3-day vocal session is happening tonight. There's 50 spots available. I don't know how many spots are available now, but there are only 50 spots available. So if you click the link down below, if the spots are taken, I'm sorry, but there will be recordings available for everybody that's there. Everybody will be able to get over and join over Zoom, and I'm getting one of the best vocalists I've ever worked with in the studio here, this studio here tonight. So if that's at all interesting to you, go ahead, click the link down in the description below, and save your seat down there. Mistake number 10 is using references to match your mixes instead of to calibrate your ears. I like to think of it like this. When I go to the eye doctor will have a thing up on the board and tell me to say, hey, I need you to go ahead and tell me what you see. So I'll go ahead and I'll take a look at the chart and I'll say, cool, I can see E, here. I can see, F, P, T, O, Z. I'm having a tough time seeing things below all of this stuff. So it's not the fact that he's saying you need to copy this exactly. He's saying this is the reference, and let's just see where yours is at in comparison to the reference. It is the only reason that this exists is so that way me and the doctor are speaking the same language. That's it. So think of your reference like the glasses eye chart. It's known objects, and it reveals how your lenses actually bend things and how they can actually help you see better. Every time that I ask somebody to make a reference track, every single band that I work with has to do one thing, and I call it the North Star. I'm asking them to list references, but I'm not asking them to say, your mix needs to sound exactly like this. I'm just asking them to say, hey, are we speaking the same language here? What do you see? What do you like? Oh, you like the big low end of those drums and how sustained those drums are. Oh, you like how tight these drums are and how they're not so sustained. It is so that way I speak the same language that the artist is speaking. And for you specifically, if you're mixing and mastering and producing your own music, reference tracks are to calibrate your ears so you know what your room sounds like, you know what your headphones sound like, before you start diving into the mix and start to make a bunch of changes. I see this all the time where the people that make their music in their studio are only listening to the music that they have made in their studio. References are to calibrate your ears, not to copy exactly all the time. Sometimes copying can help. If you're trying to get a sound that sounds like Architect, sometimes copying the Architect song and trying to get exactly as close as you can to them is a super helpful learning lesson. But reference tracks are not meant to be that way. They are meant to calibrate your ears so you know what your room sounds like. I listen to other people's music in these headphones constantly, all the time. And you should be doing the same. You should be listening to other people's music in your home studio speakers, in your headphones. Reference tracks are to calibrate your ears so you know what good sounds like. Not so that way you can just go ahead and blindly copy what somebody else is doing. Use references to calibrate your ears, not to completely match your mix to somebody else's. Mistake number 11 is you are making decisions in solo. When I am making EQ decisions, like for example on this guitar, I went ahead and I brought it down. If I was making this low-end cut or this high-end cut in solo, it might not sound as good. I might say, you know what, there's a little bit too much, mid-range, going on in here. Maybe I need to make some adjustments. Maybe I need to make some cuts. Maybe I need to make some changes here. But that's not the case all the time. What I want to do is I want to listen to it in the context of the mix overall. So this 1.5 to 2K boost, 1.3K boost here actually got the guitars to sit out in the mix a little bit more. That's not what I wanted for this track, but for sake of argument here, this is what we're doing. And so it's actually creating it a little bit of a boost through the mix and getting these guitars to cut through the mix a little bit more. Now, if I decided to make that decision in solo, so I'm going to listen to my guitars in solo, that just kind of sounds a little bit nasty. And that's something that I'd be like, you know what? I don't like it. And I don't want to use that. But I'm not making EQ decisions in solo. I'm making it in the context. Imagine I'm making dinner and I decide to taste one ingredient alone and say, oh, this dish is going to be amazing. And then I throw a bunch of other ingredients in with it, and it completely overwhelms that ingredient. It's the same thing. When you're making EQ decisions, you need to make them in the context of the whole, not in just one specific thing. Just you pulling up your guitars, trying to EQ your guitars in solo is like tasting the ingredient. The solo button is really helpful for one thing. Is my garlic going bad? Is this guitar not sounding the way I want it to? I can solo it and listen to it by itself and make some adjustments there to see maybe it actually is the guitar problem. That's what the solo button is helpful for. It's helpful for tasting one ingredient and saying, I think the garlic is going a little bad here. Maybe I need to go get a fresh clove of garlic. Instead of saying, I'm going to taste the garlic and now I know my lasagna is going to taste amazing because I tasted the garlic by itself. That's just not true. And when I say it in the context of cooking, it sounds silly, but that's how people are treating mixing, where they're grabbing the solo button and they're tasting one ingredient from the entire mix and deciding that it's good now. But as soon as they throw it in with everything else, it doesn't taste that good. Maybe you need more garlic. Maybe you need less garlic. Imagine all of the garlic that you added to a lasagna dish and you had it on a spoon and you decided to eat that spoon by itself. It's like, that might be a little too much garlic. Too much compared to what? Compared to the rest of the dish? Absolutely not. Is this too much of a boost here at around 2K for these guitars? Compared to what? The rest of the track? Maybe not. Maybe not. Mistake number 12 is scooping your mids constantly. I see this all the time. And it sounds massive by itself, but again, in the context of the track, it makes things just gone. And so let's go ahead and find these guitars here again, and let's just scoop the mids in solo. Wow, it makes those guitars sound massive. It makes them sound pretty big. There's not that mid-range bite and harshness that I'm kind of getting from this. I think we'd all kind of agree, at least to a somewhat extent, that in solo, the mid-range cut actually does kind of work. But let's go ahead and do our rule of putting it in the context of the rest of the track. Listen to how these guitars disappear when I have this EQ on cutting this area. It almost makes the guitars completely disappear. Scooping the mids can be helpful in some ways, but you kind of remove that aggression. My mentor used to always say, magic is in the mid-range, aggression is in the mid-range, attitude is in the mid-range. So you want to lock in that mid-range, and always scooping the mids is not always the best decision. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you're going for that guitar tone, and then you have to make up for it by really bringing it up in volume, where you have to shape other things around those guitars. Maybe you do want that scooped sound, but always scooping the mids just because you saw somebody do it on a YouTube video one time, you lose the magic, you lose the aggression. It may make things sound bigger in solo, but by the time you bring it back in the mix, it makes those guitars completely disappear. Mistake number 13 is you stack more guitar tracks to make things sound bigger. I will take 2 really tight guitar takes over 4 sloppy ones all day, every day. Here's the reality of quad tracking your guitars. If you don't know what double tracking is where you take a guitar, you put it in the left, you record another guitar, and you go ahead and you put it in the right. That's double tracking. One in the left and one in the right. But this is where things fall flat. When you have your guitars, so this is where things fall flat. When you have your guitars, when you add in more guitars, quad tracking your guitars, it starts to create more of a problem here because now you have more guitars that you have to deal with. Notice the little inconsistencies here that I have in my guitars. This one is a bit like right on the grid here, and then this one is slid off the grid a little bit more. Now, I could tighten that up if I wanted to with editing, but it kind of eats some of that aliveness that those guitars have and that feel. So I can see that I'm right on the grid here. I'm slightly early over here. But this one I'm late, and I'm just slightly late here. This one's pretty close to being accurate. This one's slightly early. So instead of me going through and editing everything exactly to the grid and trying to timeline everything so it's absolutely perfect, I wanted to let those guitars breathe a little bit. Well, if I tried to let 4 guitars breathe like that instead of 2, I'm creating more of a muddy mess because not everybody's coming in at the exact same time. And these milliseconds make a big difference. So I would rather have 2 tight guitars, tight guitar performances, and then not have to edit them as tight instead of having 4 quad track guitars that are all over the place. So if you quad track your guitars, that's fine, but just make sure that they are really tight. Every single one needs to be a lot tighter. You can't have 4 separate guitars hitting here, hitting all over the place. You can't have that. You need to have 4 guitars hitting just about at the same time. The more guitars you add, the more layers you add that are doing the same thing, the more they need to be a lot tighter. So it stops sounding like the sloppy choir. I'd rather have a duo, 2 people that are singing together in tune, than a sloppy choir where nobody was really sure what's going on. So quad tracking your guitars won't necessarily make them bigger all the time. A pro tip for quad tracking guitars, for me personally, if I am going to quad track guitars, I want to change the guitar tone. I want to have a set of guitars that are dealing the mid-range, and I want to have another set of guitars that are maybe boosting the low end a little bit or adding some top-end sizzle. So I'm actually changing the guitar tone between the first set of doubles and the second set of doubles. So I'm not treating guitars like quad tracks. I'm actually treating them like 2 groups of double tracks. So one set of guitars is filling out the mid-range, another set of guitars is filling out maybe the low end or the high end or whatever I'm looking for. So if I feel like my guitars are missing something, I decide what that is, and then I go ahead and add that in later. Mistake number 14 is acting like bass is a supporting element and not pretty much the entire song. Bass is the foundation. Guitars are the mid-range. A house cannot stand without a foundation. I used to do contracting before I became a full-time music producer. And if you don't build out your foundation right, the drywall that you add and everything else that you add is not going to matter because the foundation of the house is not solid. There's one thing in particular that most people miss when it comes to frequencies and just low end in general. If you look here, you can see 50 hertz and 100 hertz is a full octave. 440 hertz is an A note. That's pretty much what everybody tunes to. Some people tune to 432. Most people in the Western world are tuning to 440. 440 is an A note. If we cut that in half, we divide that by 2, that's 220 hertz. That's an A note as well. Now notice this. If we double that, that's 880. And we can keep doubling this, and there's so much more frequencies in the top end than there is in the low end. The octave between 50 hertz and 100 hertz is only 50 hertz. That's not a whole lot of room going on here. But the difference in octaves between 5,000 hertz and 10,000 hertz, still 1 octave. There's 5,000 hertz in between 5,000 and 10,000. So yes, the notes remain the same. It's still 1 octave higher, but there's a lot more content in the high end, which is why getting a nice thick high end is a smooth high end is a little bit easier than getting a nice rich foundation on the low end. Your bass fills that out. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this bass. And I have 2 different basses here. I have a bass guitar and a synth bass. If I mute this, listen to how the mix just falls flat. That is a lot more than just 2 tracks. At least it feels that way, but that's not the case. I have 2 instruments here. I have my bass guitar that's doing this, and I have my synth that's doing this. And that's filling out more like the low mids than the actual sub lows. Just turning these off makes the track feel completely different. Way more different than turning off a bunch of synthesizers that I have or some other effects that I have going on here. It makes it sound completely different. The low end is the foundation. And the reason why it's so hard is because people don't understand that the low end, 50 hertz and 100 hertz versus 5,000 hertz and 10,000 hertz up here on the top end, that's still an octave. There's less frequencies down in the low end. So we need to pay attention to what's in the low end and understand that those need to be the foundation. Now, bass also is something that we can go ahead, and I like to imagine like a big smiley face kind of curve with it. This is something that I actually will cut the mids out a little bit on the bass. You can see I kind of have a natural curve in the tone that I chose. But But I like to imagine that it's grabbing the guitars. It's almost hugging the guitars. There's a lot of low end, and then there's some of this like high mids, upper mids that's happening here as well in that bass, and it's kind of grabbing the guitars and making it sound like one big instrument. So it's one instrument altogether. That bass is that foundation, and it works really well. That's why the low end is so hard to get right. It's because maybe you have too much going on the low end, or maybe the stuff that you do have in the low end is an afterthought. Bass is the foundation. It is not an afterthought. A house cannot stand without a foundation, and a mix cannot stand without having at least intentional thoughts on where the low end is actually going to sit. So in my case, I have the kick drum, I have the bass guitar, and I have the synth that's filling out the low end for me. And together, it sounds absolutely massive. Just the bass synth, the bass, and the drums. Be intentional with where you place things in your low end. If you guys are interested in joining that vocal session with me live, links to that are down in the description below. This is a one-time thing. I don't think I'm ever going to get the opportunity to do this again. So if you are interested in working with one of the best vocalists that I've ever worked with, watching the whole process from start to finish, and even getting the stems that we record from tonight. So even if you don't have a vocalist you can work with, you can download the stems, bring it into your session, and go through the whole process. Links to that are down in the description below. Lots of great stuff that's going to happen, and there is lifetime access to all the recordings. So if you want lifetime access to all the recordings, even if you can't attend live, now is the time to join. Don't think I'm going to be able to get to do this again. And he's one of the best vocalists that I have ever worked with, and he's been super generous about able to come over here and actually record. We're going to be recording in this room, live over Zoom. I hope to see you there. Links to that are down in the description below. This is the only time that you guys will be able to get to join this session. Let me go ahead and answer some questions here in the chat as well. If you guys have any questions about either the session that's happening tonight, or if you have any questions about this mix and anything else that we've been doing, let me know. I'd love to go through and help you guys with this. A 6-song makes tutorials like this so much more bearable. That is true. That is true. I'm a big fan of making sure that you actually like the music people are making before you take advice from them. There's a thing that I was told a while back from somebody they've got a lot of accolades, and they've been in the studio they've been making music professionally for years, like since the 90s. And he said something to me that I thought was pretty funny. He said, there's a lot of people on YouTube that are pretengineers, pretending to be engineers. And that's where the problem with a lot of online information comes into play, because anybody can start a YouTube channel. Anybody can start doing this. And again, if you don't like the way my mixes sound, then please do not take my advice. I don't want to help you get better mixes that I think are better that you don't think are better. A big thing is a lot of you guys, I'm willing to bet, that are in the rock and metal space, a lot of you guys started making EDM because those are the only YouTube videos you saw. I'm curious to know, who here is making rock and metal, but has also made EDM because those were the only YouTube videos that you saw? I'm genuinely curious to know for you guys. That's the way it was for me. It's the way it was for a lot of my students. The only thing that you saw online was a lot of EDM tutorials. And the EDM is great. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it wasn't the genre that I really wanted to make completely. And so because of that, that's the only options that we had at the time. Now there's more options, but you need to be better at picking the people that you follow. First, they need to make music that you think sounds good. They don't need to be full-time in the music industry. I'm not saying they need to do that at all. They just need to have the skill that you want. All right? Secondly, is they also need to be good at teaching. It's one thing to know a skill. It's another thing to pass a skill on to somebody else. So if you're watching my YouTube videos and then you apply the things that I've taught you and your mixes sound better, congratulations, you have learned something. That means, and you like it, then I'm the person to follow. If that's not the case, then go find somebody else who you vibe with, that you learn well from, and you like the sound of their music. That's extremely important. So before you take advice from anybody online, make sure that at least 2 of that criteria is followed. They're making music that you like the sound of, and two, they are a good teacher. They have the ability to pass their skill on to you instead of just saying, well, let's just turn some knobs and till it sounds good. See, guys, it sounds so much better. I just did this and boom, everything sounds so much better now. It's like, that's not helpful. They need to have great sounding music and they need to be a good teacher before you start taking their advice online. The online space is filled with lots of people who are really good at what they do and really bad at what they do, and a lot of places in between. So make sure when you take advice from anybody online, you like the music that they make, and they are also good at being able to pass the skill that they have on to you as well. And if that's not me, by all means, go find somebody else who is. I love it. Been in the middle game since 2006, brother. Yeah. 2007 YouTube came out. I was making a country and rock pre-YouTube. After YouTube came out, there was some stuff on YouTube, and then the EDM space took over. And then I was making a lot of EDM back in like 2010, 2011. It was fun. I like EDM, I do, but it wasn't the thing I really wanted to do. I wanted to make rock and metal, right? Lots of great stuff there. How do you do your mix bus? Brandon, that's a great question. My mix bus consists of a handful of tools, nothing too crazy, but it's just a handful of tools. So over here on my mix bus, if I go ahead and I actually bring this up here, first is I always have a gain plugin at the beginning of my mix bus. This is so that way I can bring the volume up or bring the volume down, because right after that, I'm going into a compressor. And that compressor will change. This is something I learned from Andrew Sheps, where he has multiple different VCAs on his board. So if he needs to hit his master bus a little harder, he just brings his VCAs up. Or if he feels like it's hitting a little too hard, he brings it down. We're not shooting for a number here. We're just shooting for the sound. So I always have a gain plugin at the beginning of my master bus, so I can always adjust, bring things up and bring things down, and see where it sounds good. Sometimes hitting the compressor or the clipper or anything else that you have harder sounds better. Sometimes you're hitting it too hard and you need to bring it back, like I was doing here. And again, my gain staging was probably fine. I was probably sitting, again, like that -3 to -6 dB on my master bus. That was probably fine. But I realized that it was still too much going into the other plugins that I had afterwards. So I always have a gain plugin first. Second is I usually go into a compressor, and I'm just trying to get the overall vibe. And then finally, I go into a limiter. And this is what I do as I'm producing. So a little compression, a little limiting, and then a gain plugin at the beginning of the entire chain. And then I start producing, I start mixing. And then when it's time for mastering, I either turn this stuff off and render it out and bring it into a new session, or what I do mostly now is I'll just master in the exact same session. If your computer can handle it, by all means, my computer's doing great with it. I can have dropout protection set to low. I'm using like 24% CPU. It's kind of a beast of a computer. I built it like 3-4 months ago, and I've had no issues. So if your computer can handle it, awesome. If not, go ahead and render it in a different session. The only time that I will break this rule where I won't render it in the same session, or mix in the same session, or master in the same session, is if I'm mastering an entire album together. I would prefer to master all of it together at once, so that way each song sounds good from one song to the next song to the next song. Otherwise, mastering in the exact same session that you mix in is totally fine. So then when I'm ready to go to the next level with this, I'll go ahead and I'll bring in some clipping, which I have here. Not a whole lot, but just bringing down some of those overall peaks. And then what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll bring in some EQ and maybe some saturation. So I'm using a Pultec EQ, and I'm bringing up a little bit of that 60 hertz, bringing up the boost and the attenuation up a little bit, getting some thicker low end. And I'm also bringing up around that 10K as well, and boosting that about almost 4, it's not 4 dB, but it's up by 4 on the actual knob itself here, and then attenuating it as well by about 1.25. And then I bring in virtual mix bus here. A lot of people have seen this and they're like, oh, you should bring this further in the mix. This should be the first thing that you add, is your saturation, your virtual bus. And it just worked well for me here. I liked it, and so I left it. Next, I'm going into some EQ if I need any, and I'm bringing in a little bit more low end here. Like I've already done here, but I'm bringing in just a little extra. It's a little bit more targeted in a specific area. That's what digital EQs are great for. And I like this one here because there's the character, fire to water. And you can see that it kind of shapes the overall cue here and creates different shapes depending on if you have fire or water. And I liked it right around in here. I'm taking out a little bit of this mid-range density and then bringing up a little bit more of this 5K kind of shimmer to it. And then again, same thing, going into limiting. And I'm shooting for around 6 to 5 luffs, but I'm not going to let those numbers be the determining factor for anything that I do. I just want to make sure that those numbers are a thing that I can quickly look at, just like driving a car down the road. If I hear police sirens, I'm going to look around. I'm going to see, are they after me? Are they after somebody else? What's going on? But I'm not going to immediately pull over. But if I see the lights, the cop lights behind me, I'm immediately pulling off to the side of the road. I don't even need to hear the sirens. It's the same thing in the studio, but just the reversed. When you look at these numbers are like the backseat drivers. You can say, whoa, I'm hitting -12 luffs, and most of my reference tracks are hitting -4 or -6. Maybe I should pay attention to what that is. Maybe they're -8. And it's a great thing to say, oh, I should listen, but I'm not going to make my final mixing decisions based off of a number. I'm going to make my final mixing decisions based off of my ears, because shocker, that's how everyone's consuming your music anyway. They're not consuming it by looking at it. They're consuming it by listening to it. So it's like backseat drivers. So I like to use that analogy that makes a lot of sense to be able to understand when you should use these tools. When a YouTuber say never mix with your eyes, you should never mix with your eyes, it's just not true. You can mix with your eyes, but you don't make the final decisions with your eyes. You make the final decisions with your ears. It's why these tools exist. It's why we have luffs and meters and all this other stuff. We can take a look and say, wow, actually, it's giving me an extra opportunity to take a closer look at the overall volume, at the gain reduction that I have on my compressor or something like that. And that, at the end of the day, is the main goal. Great question. Great question. What exactly is the mix bus and how does it work? Great question. So you know how we have a bunch of different tracks, individual tracks here. We have our kicks, we have our snares, we have our toms, everything is here. I have, let's see how many tracks I actually have overall. It looks like I have 36 tracks in this song total, so not a whole lot, but enough. If I want to send all of this to one stereo file and compress everything all together, that's what the mix bus is. And so every DAW has the mix bus. Sometimes it's called the mix bus, sometimes it's called the 2-bus. My mentor used to call it the 2-bus all the time. He was a Pro Tools user. I'm joking. If you're a Pro Tools user, love you guys. Love you. Love you. But at the end of the day, the mix bus is that. It's a stereo bus where all of your signal goes to in one place. So your mix bus, you can go ahead and you can add a gain or compression or anything to the overall mix. And when you render out the song, you're rendering out the mix bus or the 2-bus, the master bus, the main bus, whatever you call it. I call it the master bus. My mentor used to call it the 2-bus. Some people call it a stereo bus. It doesn't matter. The main, a lot of DAWs are going to call it the main. At the end of the day, that's all that matters, is you understand that all that signal goes to one place, one bus, and you can turn everything up or down, or you can process everything all together. And that's essentially what mastering is at the end of the day. Great question. Great question. EDM Tutorials on YouTube has its saturation knob on 10 billion, and every other one of them contradict each other, which made it hard to vet when I first started. Great point. Yeah, it's tough. A lot of people contradict one another. I had Chris Baseford on my podcast, who has mixed and mastered for bands like Nickelback and Daughtry, Shinedown, Rob Zombie, and he says that he does not like mixing on Apple AirPods. It just doesn't work for him. And Zach Cervini, who is another goat in the space, in the rock and metal space, does almost 70 to 80% of his mixes on a set of Apple AirPods, and then he checks on his barefoot monitors later. It's like kind of crazy when you think about it. These two guys have tons of great sounding records behind them and tons of accolades and lots of great stuff, but they're disagreeing with the process. This is why when you watch a YouTube video and I'm explaining something to you, I say, try this. I don't say, this is how you should do things. I say, try this and experiment. That's what I typically do. If I say I had oatmeal for breakfast, you're like, okay, cool. He had oatmeal for breakfast. Maybe if I want to feel the way he feels or have a breakfast that's a lot like him, I'll eat oatmeal for breakfast too. But if I say you should have oatmeal for breakfast, you're like, screw you, man. And so when you're watching these YouTube tutorials, they're saying, this is exactly how, you should always do this. It's like, no, not all the time. Not all the time. Even when I'm breaking down these myths today, I'm saying you should understand what these tools do. That is something you should do. You should understand what you're turning, the knobs you're turning. You should understand that stuff. But I'm not saying you should always use a gate. For the example in the kick drum earlier that I used earlier, that example, I said a gate and a transient shaper can both work for what you're doing, but you need to understand the difference between the two of them. I didn't say always use a gate instead of a transient shaper, because that just wouldn't be true. There are some cases where I do use a transient shaper because I feel like there is a little bit too much of that thunder that I was talking about on that kick drum, and a transient shaper worked really well for that. You need to understand. The only thing I say you should do is you should understand what the tools do. You should understand when I twist a knob, I should know what it's doing. And I should know in my head, I can hear something and it's not there yet, I should know what this does. This is the thing that I do with all of my one-on-one students, where they're diving into their mixes and they're like, how do I make my drum sound better? And I'll say, cool, let's do this. Let's add a compressor. Let's add a saturator. But I don't just say, let's add some saturation and crank the knob up. Sounds good to go. And in all reality, if I wanted them to work with me more, if I wanted them to hire me for the actual music production and mixing side of things instead of them learning it themselves, that's what I should do. But that's not what I'm actually doing, because I want them to be able to understand how to fish. Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for the rest of his life. And when I'm working with my one-on-one students, I'm not saying, hey, let's turn the ratio to 4-to-1, let's bring the threshold down a little bit. I'm saying turn the ratio to 4-to-1, bring the threshold down a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring the makeup gain back up. Turn it on and off. Do you hear the difference? Now that you hear the difference, this is why it works that way. So that way they understand why I made that decision to begin with. A lot of YouTube tutorials just don't do that. And it's a bummer. It really is. And it was stuff that I just wish I had when I was getting into this originally. And that's the whole point of this channel. It's what I'm trying to do. It's how I'm trying to help people. Might be a noob question. Dude, you are in the right spot for noob questions, if it is a noob question. That's the whole title of this video. It might be a noob question, but how do you start trusting your own ears? I love this. I love this. A good friend of mine told me years ago, I was like, dude, like I've made some mixes and I've got it out. I said, I just don't know how to, is it good enough? I'm not really trusting myself. And so he said, there's two things that you need to understand in order to start trusting your ears. One, you cannot trust your ears if you are making music in an echo chamber. Every single one of my students get inside of a community of other people where they can share their music and they can share it with lots of other people as well. If you can get into a community, either online or in person, to be able to share your music, it gives you more trust, because then lots of people are saying, hey, your low end is dipping a little bit here. And you're like, I thought it was. And so then you can go in and start fixing it. That gives you a lot of trust, because other people around you are able to say, hey, you're hearing things properly. That helps you trust your ears. And the second thing is, the more music that you make, the more trust you're going to have to begin with. We don't get confidence by shouting affirmations in the mirror. I'm a great mixer. Like, you don't get confidence that way. That's just delusion at the end of the day. That's just straight up delusion. You don't get confidence that way. You get confidence by a stack of undeniable proof that you are who you say you are. I have made thousands of songs at this point in time. And so I can mix with confidence, and I can trust my ears, because one, I got a mentor and I was working with other people and I'm sharing my mixes with bands and they're all saying it's sounding great. And two, I've made thousands of songs. So once you've gotten to that point, you can start to really trust your ears. Confidence doesn't come from the first song you release. It comes from the 10th, the 12th. It comes from the 18th person that's told you that this sounds great. That's where confidence comes from. It doesn't come from just looking in the mirror and saying, I'm a good mixing engineer, or looking at a number on a DAW and saying, well, it's hitting -4 lofts, so it must be I'm good. Confidence comes after the song is out, and it comes from other people also agreeing with you that they think it sounds good. Specifically people that you don't know that are in a group with you as well. If you're trying to share this with your friends and your family, sometimes they're going to spare you, and they're going to say, no, man, it sounds great, honestly, but they're just trying to preserve the relationship. When somebody hires me, I want to preserve the relationship that I have with them, but I care more about them getting great mixes. And so I'm going to tell them the truth, even if it hurts their feelings. And you need to get around other people who are doing the same thing, who are willing to tell you the truth, even if it hurts your feelings. And then you'll start to trust your ears more, because you've heard the stuff. You're starting to develop patterns. That's how you gain confidence. That's how you gain trust. It never comes from the first song you release. It always comes after you've released songs and you've got around other people telling you that, yes, this sounds good. No, this needs to be fixed just a little bit more. That's where confidence comes from. Hopefully that makes sense. Great question, by the way. Great question. Brandon, do you have two main buses? How do you create those? Okay, so the two buses that I have is, one is a main bus, and the other is a listen bus. So the main bus is where I can add all my plugins and I can process things. The listen bus is where I can turn the volume down without affecting the overall fader of the main. I want to leave my main right here at 0, and then I can turn this up or down. I can also create a listen bus, and I can add a session wire to it, so I can send audio separately. So, or I can go ahead and I can add VSX, like the headphone emulation that I have that I absolutely love. I can go ahead and create it on a listen bus. So it separates it out. Sometimes I want to create another bus so that way the band can hear themselves as they're playing, but they're not hearing the same thing I'm hearing in the control room. So I'll create another listen bus for them and send it out. It's nice to be able to split things out like that. Hopefully that makes sense. It's -4 left, so I'm good at mixing. Bro, that was... What's with the personal attacks? Oh man. Oh man. I'm sorry. It was not personal. It was not personal. It was not personal. It was personal to me. I used to do that all the time. I used to look at numbers and decide if that made me a good mixer or not. But I started to realize there were great mixes that hit -6, and there were bad mixes that hit -6 LUFS. Meters just lie. They don't lie. They just don't give you the full picture. That's how it is. It's also not something you can check off a list and it's done. You do enough, and eventually, without even thinking about it, you just be like, oh crap, wait, I'm crushing. Exactly, man. Exactly. That's exactly how that works. You get to a point where you're just like, yeah, I'm making some pretty good music, right? You almost have to get past that fear a little bit in order to be able to move on to the next thing. And that is the main goal. That is the main goal. You just got to get past that a little bit of fear, and it's good. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. All right, let's go ahead and keep going. My family's not that nice to me. I showed my dad last night, and he laughed at it. Yeah, Adam. There's when you're closer, either they're going to spare the relationship or they'll make fun of you. So like there's two balances here, right? Where like when you're trying to get advice from family members, you're trying to get advice from close friends, they're not going to give you the actual true advice, because the reality is when I listen to a song, we get on, my job is to listen to the song and not listen to the story I already know about you, right? Same thing with all of the other members inside of my community. When they share a mix and other people are listening to it as well, they don't really know each other that well. They know each other well enough now, but they get in, they're like, oh, this guy, he makes rock and metal, right? So as soon as you join, my community and you're like working with other people in there, people are like, oh yeah, I know Adam. He makes us, some of this rock music. It sounds like this. They don't know you from work. They don't know you from childhood. They don't know you when you play video games. They don't know you from all this other stuff. They know you and your music. And so they're able to actually give you better advice because of that. People have a tough time looking past that. Like if I ask my mom to listen to some of my music, she's going to be like, it sounds great, honey, but why all the screams? Like why the screaming stuff all the time, right? And if I was to tell a friend some of the stuff that I have as well, he may laugh at it and be like, that's you screaming? Dude, what? Like what? And they're going to say stuff like that because they're so worried about me and not worried about the music that I made. Does that make sense? And so when you get advice from other people, you have to kind of go one step back. Try to get in online groups. Try to get in groups that are like maybe local groups, but people don't know who you are entirely, right? It's just like when you get a new job. You go from one job to the next. Nobody has pre-consisting beliefs with what you got, right? It's just you're just you, and that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Parents are going to say if they like it or not if it's actually good. Yeah, exactly. So I always like to make sure that, people are actually working there, specifically with other people, and Adam, you're in the community. So like, again, you can use the community more often as well. We just did a song, was it last Saturday? We did an entire session where we listened to everybody's music together. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, by the way, if you guys are interested in working with me directly and getting inside the community that I talked about and actually helping you get great sounding music in the next 90 days or less, links to that are down in the description below. It says work with me. You can click on that. And if you're not ready, again, it's application based only. So I have to get on a call with you to even see if you're a good fit. Links to that are there. I also have that vocal session that's happening tonight. So if you are interested in knowing exactly how to get professional sounding vocals in your home studio, links to that are down in the description below. Save your seat. There's only 50 spots available. Hope you enjoy it. There's a lot of good stuff that's going on there, and he's a phenomenal vocalist. One of the best vocalists I've ever worked with my entire life. How does gain staging change when you have 16 tracks versus something like 60 tracks? It's a great question. When you have multiple different tracks, every time you add a new signal on top of another one, it adds a collective volume, right? But for example, if we bring in, let's say these vocals here. Let's solo these vocals, right? So we have...
I will lie down in your grave.
Let me go ahead and just turn off all of my master bus processing here. And then I'll go ahead and I'll just grab a meter. Just a level meter here, right? So here's the vocal.
Lie down in your grave. If that meant I could take your pain away.
So with one vocal, we're hitting here.
Down in your grave.
By -6, right? So if I bring in another vocal that's also hitting around the same amount, that -6. You would think that, well, -6, then so from 0 to -6, another one from 0 to -6, that's going to lift the signal up by double. Not really. So let me show you what happens when I actually bring in that other double.
Down in your grave, if that meant I could take your...
So it's bringing it up more, but it's not necessarily bringing it up by double. So every single thing that I add, it does increase the overall volume, and the gain staging does change, but it doesn't change in the way that you think. It's not exponential, right? Where every single track that you add is doubling the signal, right? We even know this in pan laws. So for example, at DAWs, when you are panning things inside of your DAW, when you have the same signal, when it's in the middle here, where you have the same signal coming out of both the left and the right speaker, what they do is they say, cool, they're playing out of both at the same time, so we'll go ahead and we'll leave that alone. But if I pan to the right or I pan all the way to the left, I am losing half of that signal. Now you're thinking, okay, well, you're losing half of the signal. What do we do to make up for that? Well, DAWs do a thing called pan laws where they do this automatically. Every DAW does it pretty much the same, where if it's in the center, it's equal between both the left and the right ear, which means that it's in the center. But if I pan it to the right, what they do is they actually turn the volume up by about 3 dB. And Studio Pro kind of shows you how this works, where like there's this like fader that gets turned up. So not only is it panning it to the right, it's also turning it up by about 3 dB. On average, for the most part, when you have the same sound coming out of both speakers or both headphones, when you lose one, you lose about 3 dB of energy that comes from that. And so they make up for it with pan laws, so it feels a lot more even.
Your pain away on your behalf. I'd split in half to make you whole again. I would lie down in your grave if that meant...
And it feels like it's even, but it's actually bringing up the volume by around 3 dB. So just because you brought something in and you've brought in another signal on top of that doesn't mean that you just duplicated the signal and now you got double the amount of volume that's coming through. It does increase the volume, but not by as much as you may think. So that's how the relationship of it changes. There's tons of different things online. You can go like crazy with these forums online where people are talking about the different types of pan laws and when you should be applying the plus 3 dB pan law and everything else like that. I don't worry too much about it. I understand what it does, and I understand. I used to go down that rabbit hole, and I was crazy. I was trying to change the pan laws on my DAW, and now I just leave it as it is because people that are a lot smarter than me that coded this stuff in to begin with understand that a bit more when it comes to the overall panning. So that the normal pan laws inside of your DAW, for the most part, you're going to be just fine, but it's worth knowing about. It's worth understanding how that works. And that's essentially how it happens when you bring in another signal. Just because I brought in another vocal doesn't mean that I got double the amount of signal. I got about a 3 dB lift. We went from 6 dB, -6 to -3 dB. So I got about a 3 dB lift by bringing in that other vocal. So that's how that works and why that matters. Great question. Great question. All right. We are going to have to end it here pretty soon, so I want to make sure that if I didn't get any of your questions, my apologies, but links to the vocal session, the 3-day vocal session, are down in the description below. You will get lifetime access to all of the recordings from the event. You will get access to a private community where you can get feedback on your music, not just from me, but also from the vocalist that I'm having in the studio. He is one of the best vocalists I've ever worked with, and when I asked him if he would do this, he said yes, and I was shocked that he said yes. I'm super excited about this. It's going to be an absolute blast. We start tonight. As soon as we start tonight, the doors close. You will never be able to join this again. If you are interested, links to that are down in the description below. It's one of the most affordable things that I do, trying to get you in and trying to get you working with great vocals. If you want to know exactly how to find and capture a great performance, how to get a great performance, how to choose a microphone, how to set up acoustic treatment if you don't have any, or how to get a good sound out of the room that you don't even have acoustic treatment in. If you're looking to comp vocals and mix vocals and edit vocals, to tune vocals, we're going to be covering all of that over the next 3 days, and you get lifetime access to all the recordings. Links to that are down in the description below. I love it. All right. I'll see you guys all later, and we will definitely be doing another live stream here pretty soon. Hopefully, I'll see you guys tonight on the live session over Zoom. Everyone's cameras can be on, mics can be on. We can actually be talking back and forth. So I'd like to see you inside of the session if you can make it tonight. And if not, the recordings will still be available. Anyway, I'd love to see you inside of the community. I'll be leaving that community open all week, and you guys will get lifetime access to all of the recordings.